April 1865. As America struggled to rise from a bloody civil war, the hope of national healing was beginning to kindle. President Abraham Lincoln, the man who had steered the nation through the storm, could finally see a new dawn. But a single shot at Ford's Theater extinguished it all. It not only claimed the life of a great man, but also plunged the entire nation into the darkness of mourning and uncertainty. This assassination was not merely a historical event, it was a tragic turning point that derailed America's future. Let us look back not just at the tragedy, but also explore the real man behind the icon, a Lincoln of quiet pain and extraordinary resolve who shaped history. Lincoln's early years weren't just humble, they were laced with relentless loss, economic instability, and a quiet rebellion against his roots that fueled his lifelong drive for self-improvement. Born on February 12, 1809, in a one-room log cabin on Sinking Spring Farm in Hardin County, Kentucky, he entered the world as the second child of Thomas Lincoln and Nancy Hanks Lincoln. This modest dwelling, measuring about 16 by 18 feet with a dirt floor and no windows, symbolized the frontier hardship that defined his childhood. The family soon relocated to nearby Knob Creek Farm, still in Kentucky, in an attempt to sustain their agrarian lifestyle amid rolling hills and rocky soil that made farming a constant battle. Life here was raw. Endless chores like chopping wood, planting crops, and tending livestock dominated daily routines, with poverty biting at every edge. Legal disputes over land titles, common in the poorly surveyed frontier, drained their resources, teaching young Abe the sting of injustice and the fragility of property rights early on. These experiences instilled in him a remarkable resilience and adaptability, qualities that would later help him navigate the political turbulence of a divided nation. His father, Thomas, worked as a farmer and carpenter, but Lincoln later viewed him critically as embodying a lack of ambition, laziness, and resistance to intellectual pursuits, traits he consciously sought to avoid in forging his own path. Despite these perceptions, his parents emphasized moral living and deep religiosity, instilling in their children a strong ethical foundation that explicitly condemned slavery as immoral, rooted in their Baptist faith. At the time of Abraham's birth, Thomas owned land and livestock, suggesting relative prosperity in a community where many were landless squatters. However, subsequent losses due to flawed land titles, Kentucky's chaotic land system led to overlapping claims, and mounting legal costs eroded this stability, plunging the family deeper into financial difficulties. Biographies like Ronald C. White's A. Lincoln analyze how these early dynamics profoundly influenced Lincoln, teaching him the value of hard physical work while simultaneously fueling his desire for intellectual growth over mere manual toil. The moral lessons from his parents, particularly their anti-slavery stance, derived from Christian principles that viewed all humans as equal before God, laid the groundwork for his lifelong commitment to justice and equality. This foundation helped him develop a principled worldview amid the challenges of frontier life, where survival often trumped ideals. Yet Lincoln's innate sense of fairness began to emerge. In 1816, when Lincoln was just 7 years old, the family migrated to Perry County, now Spencer County, Indiana, in search of better opportunities, escaping the persistent land disputes in Kentucky that had cost them dearly. This move represented a significant shift, trading familiar surroundings for a harsher climate with denser forests and more demanding labor, in a new territory still teeming with wildlife and Native American influences. The journey itself was arduous, involving flatboats and wagons over rough terrain, and upon arrival, they had to clear land for a new cabin, a process that involved felling trees and building from scratch. Tragedy struck in 1818 at the tender age of 9 when his mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, succumbed to milk sickness, a common rural ailment caused by consuming milk from cows that had grazed on poisonous white snakeroot plants. This loss devastated Lincoln, leaving a lasting emotional scar that exacerbated tensions with his father, whom he felt was insufficiently attentive to the family's needs, often prioritizing work over emotional support. Historians like Michael Burlingame in The Inner World of Abraham Lincoln delve into how this event is frequently associated with accounts of Lincoln's later melancholic disposition, an introspective and somber trait that persisted throughout his life, manifesting in periods of deep depression that he called the hypos. The psychological impact was profound. Young Abe helped build his mother's coffin and attended her burial in a simple frontier grave, experiences that instilled a fatalistic view of life and a preoccupation with death that echoed in his later writings and speeches. In the interim following Nancy's death, his older sister Sarah, then just 11, stepped in as a caregiver, providing temporary maternal support during this turbulent time by handling cooking, cleaning, and sibling care in a household now bereft of its emotional anchor. By December 1819, Thomas remarried Sarah Bush Johnston, a widow from Kentucky with 3 children of her own. She emerged as a profoundly positive force in Lincoln's life, treating him as her biological son and aiding in the emotional recovery from his mother's death. Credited with nurturing his passion for reading and cultivating his renowned sense of humor, often self-deprecating and folksy, she played a pivotal role in building his confidence and communication skills. Lincoln affectionately called her Mama, reflecting a deep bond and gratitude as she became the maternal figure who truly shaped his maturing personality and encouraged his intellectual curiosities. Unlike his father, who saw reading as idleness, Sarah Bush Johnston recognized Abe's potential and even brought books from her own collection, including The Arabian Nights and biographies that sparked his imagination. This stepmother-son relationship highlights one of Lincoln's life contradictions. Amid familial strife and loss, he found pockets of warmth that bolstered his resilience, allowing him to channel grief into ambition. Lincoln received only minimal formal education, totaling about 1 year in makeshift rural schools known as blab schools, where students recited lessons aloud in one-room log buildings with crude benches and no blackboards. Relying instead on self-directed learning that defined his intellectual development, he displayed an intense passion for reading and knowledge acquisition from a young age. Often criticized by neighbors as lazy because he favored books over strenuous farm work, like splitting rails or plowing fields, this dedication transformed him into an intelligent, articulate, and well-liked young man. He devoured a wide array of texts, including the Bible for its moral and rhetorical depth, which influenced his speech patterns with biblical cadences, Shakespeare's works for their dramatic insight into human nature, teaching him about ambition, tragedy, and folly, Aesop's fables for lessons in wisdom and ethics, honing his storytelling, and historical accounts like Parson Weems' Life of Washington, which broadened his understanding of the world and instilled patriotic ideals. During his years in Indiana, Lincoln would borrow books from neighbors or trek long distances, sometimes 20 miles, to obtain them, turning self-education into the cornerstone of his future success. This pursuit not only expanded his knowledge but also honed his critical thinking, storytelling abilities, and wit, enabling him to transcend his impoverished background and prepare for broader societal and political engagements. A little-known fact from the National Constitution Center's records reveals that Lincoln was the first president born outside the original 13 colonies, underscoring his frontier origins and how they shaped his outsider perspective in national politics. By 1830, the Lincoln family relocated to Macon County, Illinois, a free state without slavery, signaling the end of their Indiana chapter and the start of a new phase in the Midwest where opportunities for free labor seemed brighter. At 22 years old in 1831, Lincoln struck out on his own, leaving his family to settle in New Salem, Illinois, a small village of about 100 people along the Sangamon River, where he began independent work and formed social connections. That spring, while ferrying goods by flatboat to New Orleans, a 1,200-mile journey down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, he encountered slavery up close for the first time, witnessing a slave auction and the brutal realities of the institution, including families torn apart and humans treated as chattel. This direct exposure reinforced his ingrained belief that slavery was fundamentally wrong, intensifying his moral opposition and serving as a critical moment in the evolution of his political views. The journey was more than a mere job. It became a turning point that influenced his later anti-slavery advocacy and decisions in public life, embedding a sense of urgency in his fight against injustice. Analyzing this episode, historians note how it contrasted with his parents' abstract moral teachings, making the horror visceral and personal, perhaps contributing to his later eloquence in describing slavery as a monstrous injustice. Here's something rarely shared that adds psychological depth. During his Indiana years, Lincoln experienced another profound loss when his sister Sarah died in childbirth in 1828 at age 20. This event, overlooked in many narratives, deepened his melancholy, as she had been a surrogate mother figure after Nancy's death. Burlingame's analysis suggests this compounded grief fostered Lincoln's empathy for human suffering, a trait evident in his presidential pardons for soldiers and his compassionate Reconstruction vision. Moreover, a lesser-known quote from Lincoln reflects his early philosophical bent. "I have never had a feeling politically that did not spring from the sentiments embodied in the Declaration of Independence, spoken in 1861, but rooted in his formative self-education." This underscores how his frontier hardships didn't embitter him, but refined his commitment to equality, setting the stage for his rise. Upon arriving in New Salem, Illinois, Abraham Lincoln embarked on a series of humble occupations to support himself while building his independence in this small frontier village of log cabins and dirt roads. He took on various odd jobs, including working as a clerk in a general store owned by Denton Offutt, where he honed his interpersonal skills through daily interactions with customers, earning a reputation for honesty and fairness, traits that would later define his public persona and earn him the nickname Honest Abe. A famous anecdote from this time, when he accidentally shortchanged a customer by a few pennies, he walked miles to return the money, illustrating his integrity in a community where trust was currency. This period of manual and clerical labor allowed him to integrate into the community, where he also engaged in physical tasks like rail splitting, chopping thousands of rails for fences, and flatboating, further developing his physical strength and practical knowledge of frontier life. Standing at 6 feet 4 inches, Lincoln was the tallest president in history, and his lanky frame gave him an advantage in labor, though it also made him self-conscious about his appearance, which he often joked about to deflect ridicule. Amid these endeavors, Lincoln's innate curiosity drove him to continue his self-education, borrowing books whenever possible and participating in local debates at the New Salem Debating Society, which sharpened his oratory abilities and deepened his understanding of politics and society. He read voraciously, including Euclid's geometry, to train his logical thinking. a detail from Miller Center biographies that highlights his methodical mind. In 1832, Lincoln made his initial foray into politics by announcing his candidacy for the Illinois state legislature, motivated by a desire to improve infrastructure like river navigation and education in the region, issues close to his flatboating experiences. Although he ultimately lost the election, finishing 8th out of 13 candidates, he performed remarkably well in his local precinct, securing 277 out of 300 votes in New Salem, a testament to his growing popularity and ability to connect with ordinary people through straightforward, honest campaigning that emphasized common sense reforms. Prior to the election results, Lincoln volunteered for service in the Illinois militia during the Black Hawk War, a brief conflict sparked by tensions with Native American tribes led by Chief Black Hawk over land disputes in northern Illinois and Wisconsin. Appointed as a captain by his men, a rare honor for someone without military experience, he led a company of volunteers but saw no direct combat, instead gaining valuable leadership experience and military discipline during the 3-month campaign. This episode not only bolstered his public image as a capable and patriotic figure, but also exposed him to the complexities of frontier conflicts and governance, influencing his later views on national unity and indigenous relations. Interestingly, Lincoln later humorously recounted mustering his troops and forming lines, admitting his inexperience, which humanizes him as a leader who learned through trial. Following his electoral defeat, Lincoln persisted in New Salem, assuming roles that provided steady income and community involvement while allowing time for further self-study. In 1833, he was appointed postmaster of New Salem, a position that involved sorting mail and managing a small post office within the general store, which kept him informed about current events through newspapers and correspondence, fueling his intellectual growth. This job paid poorly, about $50 a year, but allowed him to read undelivered newspapers, broadening his worldview. Concurrently, he trained as a surveyor, learning the technical skills of land measurement through borrowed instruments and manuals like Gibson's Treatise on Surveying, a job that required precision and travel across the countryside, helping him map out properties and resolve disputes in a rapidly developing area. Throughout these years, Lincoln's commitment to self-education remained unwavering. He read extensively on history, literature, and law, often walking miles to obtain books, transforming these practical jobs into opportunities for personal advancement and laying the groundwork for his professional ambitions. A hidden detail: Lincoln was inducted into the Wrestling Hall of Fame for his undefeated record in nearly 300 matches during this time, showcasing his physical prowess and earning respect in a rough and tumble community. This contrasts with his intellectual side, revealing a man who balanced brawn and brain. Determined to elevate his career beyond manual trades, Lincoln turned his focus to the legal profession in the mid-1830s, rigorously teaching himself the intricacies of law without formal schooling. He immersed himself in foundational texts such as William Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws of England, along with other legal treatises like Chitty's Pleadings, studying late into the night by candlelight in his modest quarters above the store. This self-directed regimen, often interrupted by depression spells, culminated in his successful passage of the Illinois bar examination in 1836, marking his official entry into the legal field at age 27. The following year, in 1837, he relocated to Springfield, the state capital, to establish his law practice, partnering initially with John T. Stewart, a cousin of Mary Todd, and later with William Herndon, which provided a stable base for his burgeoning career. In Springfield, a growing town of about 1,500 people with brick buildings and political buzz, Lincoln quickly distinguished himself as a versatile and effective attorney, handling a diverse caseload typical of a prairie lawyer, including debt collections, property disputes, criminal defenses, and even railroad litigation as the industry expanded westward. Known for his logical arguments, empathy toward clients, and unwavering integrity, he once advised aspiring lawyers to determine to be honest in all events. And if, in your own judgment, you cannot be an honest lawyer, resolve to be honest without being a lawyer, a principle he embodied throughout his practice, even walking away from cases he deemed unjust. His courtroom prowess extended to the Illinois Supreme Court, where he argued 175 cases, achieving notable success by winning 31 out of 51 cases as the sole defense attorney, demonstrating his analytical depth and persuasive skills that relied on clear reasoning rather than theatrics. This legal tenure not only secured his financial stability, earning him up to $3,000 annually by the 1850s, but also expanded his network among influential figures, preparing him for higher political aspirations. Deep analysis reveals Lincoln's law practice as a microcosm of his character. He often represented the underdog, like in the Almanac trial of 1858, where he used an almanac to disprove a witness's moonlight claim, saving a client from murder charges. This case highlights his ingenuity and commitment to truth, traits that would define his presidency. Amid his professional rise, Lincoln's personal life took a significant turn in December 1839, when he met Mary Todd, a well-educated and spirited woman from a prominent slave-owning family in Kentucky, during a social gathering in Springfield at her sister's home. Their shared intellectual interests, discussions on literature and politics, and lively conversation sparked a romance, leading to an engagement in December 1840. However, doubts about his social standing as a self-made man from humble origins and financial prospects prompted Lincoln to abruptly end the engagement in January 1841, plunging him into a profound episode of depression that friends described as near suicidal, exacerbating his inherent melancholic tendencies and causing him to withdraw from society for months. This fatal 1st of January, as he called it, involved weight loss, incoherent ramblings, and friends removing sharp objects as detailed in Joshua Wolfshank's Lincoln's Melancholy. The psychological depth here is striking. Lincoln's depression, likely clinical, stemmed from fears of inadequacy and past losses, yet it also sharpened his empathy, making him a more compassionate leader. Through mutual friends and persistent reconciliation efforts, the couple mended their relationship, culminating in their marriage on November 4th, 1842, when Lincoln was 33. The wedding was a modest affair held at Mary's sister's home, symbolizing the beginning of a complex but devoted partnership marked by Mary's ambition for her husband's career. She pushed him toward politics, and Lincoln's deep affection for her, despite occasional strains from differing temperaments, her volatility versus his calm and backgrounds, her aristocratic upbringing versus his rustic one. An overlooked fact was their marriage license was issued the day of the wedding, and Lincoln engraved "Love is Eternal" on Mary's ring, a rare romantic gesture from a man often seen as stoic. The Lincolns' family life unfolded in Springfield, where they purchased and expanded a home at 8th and Jackson Streets in 1844 for $1,500, turning it into a hub of warmth and activity, though shadowed by profound losses. Their first son, Robert Todd Lincoln, arrived in 1843, followed by Edward Eddie Baker Lincoln in 1846, William Willie Wallace Lincoln in 1850, and Thomas Tad Lincoln in 1853. Lincoln proved to be an unusually indulgent and affectionate father for the era, often described as loving his children peculiarly by allowing them freedoms like running through his law office, interrupting meetings, or even pulling books from shelves, a permissive parenting style rooted in his own challenging childhood, devoid of such tenderness. Tragically, the family endured devastating bereavements. Eddie died in 1850 at age 3 from tuberculosis, a lingering illness that left Lincoln inconsolable, visiting his grave frequently. Willie succumbed in 1862 at age 11 to typhoid fever during Lincoln's presidency, an event that shattered both parents, with Mary descending into prolonged grief and Lincoln withdrawing to weep alone. These losses intensified Mary's emotional instability, contributing to her later mental health issues, including depression, hallucinations, and erratic behavior that led to her 1875 institutionalization. For Lincoln, they deepened his introspective sorrow and resilience as he sought solace in work and faith. Robert was the only son to reach adulthood, going on to a successful career as a lawyer and diplomat, while Tad's death in 1871 from pleurisy further compounded the family's grief. Despite these hardships, the Lincolns' bond provided mutual support, with Mary playing a key role in polishing Lincoln's social graces, teaching him etiquette, and encouraging his political pursuits, though their marriage was marked by public arguments and her spending habits that strained finances. Parallel to his legal and family developments, Lincoln's political career gained momentum through his service in the Illinois House of Representatives, where he secured election in 1834 and served 4 consecutive 2-year terms until 1842, representing Sangamon County as a member of the Whig Party. During the 1835 to 1836 session, he advocated for progressive reforms, notably supporting the expansion of suffrage to all white males over 21, irrespective of property ownership, which aligned with his belief in democratic equality and helped modernize Illinois' electoral system by broadening participation. On the contentious issue of slavery, Lincoln adopted a free soil position, viewing the institution as inherently unjust and morally wrong. Yet he initially cautioned against immediate abolition, arguing that it might exacerbate social divisions rather than resolve them, a pragmatic stance influenced by his legal training in compromise. He favored containing slavery's spread into new territories, reflecting a balanced approach drawn from his frontier experiences where economic interdependence with slave states was real, while voting against pro-slavery measures and promoting internal improvements, like canals and railroads, to foster economic growth and unity. This legislative tenure honed his skills in debate, coalition building, and policy making, establishing him as a thoughtful leader committed to infrastructure development and ethical governance, setting the stage for his national emergence. Deep insight. Lincoln's Whig affiliation emphasized government intervention for progress, contrasting with democratic individualism, and his speeches during this period reveal an evolving anti-slavery rhetoric that avoided radicalism to maintain electability. In a unique intersection of his inventive mind and legal expertise, Lincoln obtained a patent in 1849 for an innovative device designed to lift boats over river shoals using inflatable bellows, inspired by his earlier flatboating experiences on the Mississippi, where snags often grounded vessels. Although the invention was never commercially produced, prototypes failed in testing, it remains a historical curiosity, making him the only U.S. president to hold a patent and underscoring his practical ingenuity and problem-solving abilities amid his multifaceted career. This overlooked aspect highlights Lincoln's curiosity beyond politics, a man who tinkered with mechanics as a way to address real-world issues, much like his approach to national crises. In 1846, Abraham Lincoln, a dedicated member of the Whig Party and an admirer of Henry Clay's political philosophy of American system economics, including tariffs, banks, and internal improvements, achieved a significant milestone by winning election to the U.S. House of Representatives from Illinois' 7th Congressional District, beginning his single two-year term in December 1847. During his time in Congress, he actively engaged in legislative efforts aligned with Whig principles, such as supporting internal improvements and economic policies to build infrastructure, while emerging as a principled voice on moral issues like slavery. One of his notable initiatives was co-authoring a bill aimed at abolishing slavery in the District of Columbia, proposing a gradual emancipation with compensation for slave owners and a popular vote among white residents, but he ultimately withdrew it due to insufficient support from colleagues and the broader political climate dominated by sectional tensions. This bill, rarely discussed, shows Lincoln's early willingness to legislate against slavery in federal jurisdictions, a precursor to the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln also became a prominent critic of the Mexican-American War, which he viewed as an unjust, expansionist conflict driven by President James K. Polk's ambitions to acquire territory for slavery's potential spread. Famously introducing spot resolutions that demanded Polk specify the exact location where American blood was first shed on American soil to justify the war's outbreak, Lincoln's stance earned him respect among anti-war factions, but alienated many constituents in his pro-war district, leading to a loss of political backing and the derisive nickname Spotty Lincoln for his perceived nitpicking scrutiny. His term concluded in March 1849 without seeking re-election, marking a temporary retreat from national politics amid growing disillusionment with the partisan strife and the war's popularity back home. Analysis from Britannica notes this period as formative, where Lincoln learned the limits of congressional power and the dangers of moral stands in a divided polity. Following the end of his congressional service in 1849, Lincoln returned to Springfield, Illinois, to resume his law practice, focusing on rebuilding his professional life and financial stability after the interruptions of public office. He and his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, had by this time established their family home in Springfield, the only residence they ever owned, which served as a center for their domestic life amid the demands of his career, complete with expansions for their growing family. Over the next several years, Lincoln honed his reputation as one of the state's most skilled attorneys, handling a wide range of cases from circuit courts to higher appeals, and eventually arguing before the U.S. Supreme Court in 1858 in the case of Lewis versus Lewis, though he lost that particular matter on a technicality involving admiralty law. This period of legal immersion allowed him to travel extensively on the Illinois circuit, a grueling 400-mile loop of courts where lawyers rode horseback between towns, forging connections with judges, fellow lawyers, and communities, while his caseload included everything from land disputes and debt collections to more complex corporate and railroad litigation for companies like the Illinois Central Railroad, solidifying his status as a pragmatic and ethical practitioner. However, beneath this professional success lay a sense of political disillusionment, as the national debates over slavery and expansion increasingly troubled him, prompting a gradual shift from Whig loyalty toward a more active anti-slavery position, As events like the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 unfolded, forcing Northerners to aid in slave recapture, the political flame ignites. Lincoln's reemergence in politics in 1854 was spurred by his profound opposition to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, a controversial law sponsored by Senator Stephen A. Douglas that repealed the Missouri Compromise by permitting new territories to determine the status of slavery through popular sovereignty, potentially allowing its spread northward into areas previously designated free. This legislation ignited Lincoln's moral outrage as he saw it as a dangerous concession to the slave power that threatened the nation's foundational principles of liberty and equality. He articulated his hatred for slavery not merely as a personal sentiment, but as a recognition of its monstrous injustice that degraded human dignity and undermined the Republic's democratic ideals, arguing that it created economic and social divisions harmful to free labor and national unity. Drawing on his interpretation of the Founding Fathers, Lincoln contended that while they did not view all people as equal in attributes like intelligence or physical strength, they unequivocally intended for every individual to possess equal inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, as enshrined in the Declaration of Independence, a document he revered as the apple of gold in the Constitution's picture of silver. This stance motivated him to deliver speeches and engage in public discourse, positioning him as a thoughtful critic of slavery's expansion and reigniting his passion for political involvement after years of relative quiet. Deep insight from Miller Center. This act aroused Lincoln as nothing before, transforming him from a retired politician into a national figure. The passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854 shattered the Whig Party, exposing deep internal rifts over slavery and leading to its rapid decline as members defected to various factions like the Know-Nothings or Democrats. In this turbulent political landscape, Lincoln played a pivotal role in the formation of the new Republican Party, which coalesced as an anti-slavery coalition, attracting disillusioned Whigs, Free Soilers, who opposed slavery's extension into territories, and anti-slavery Democrats seeking a unified platform against the institution's growth. By 1856, Lincoln had become a prominent leader within the nascent party in Illinois, helping to organize conventions and recruit supporters through his eloquent advocacy for free soil principles and economic policies like tariffs and infrastructure that appealed to Northern interests. That year, at the Republican National Convention in Philadelphia, he garnered significant attention by finishing second in the balloting for the vice presidential nomination, behind William L. Dayton, a result that highlighted his rising stature and ability to appeal to a broad coalition of moderates and reformers committed to halting slavery's spread while preserving the Union. An overlooked aspect, Lincoln's speeches during this formation emphasized economic arguments against slavery, noting how it undercut white laborers' wages, a tactic to broaden appeal beyond moral grounds. In June 1858, after securing the Republican nomination for the U.S. Senate seat in Illinois, Lincoln delivered his iconic House Divided speech at the state Republican convention in Springfield, a powerful address that encapsulated the nation's precarious state amid the slavery crisis. He famously declared, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free," drawing from biblical imagery in Mark 3:25 to warn that the Union would inevitably become all one thing or all the other, underscoring the existential threat posed by sectional divisions and the moral imperative to confront slavery's expansion. This speech set the stage for his high-profile campaign against the incumbent Democrat, Stephen A. Douglas, culminating in 7 formal debates held across Illinois from August to October 1858 in towns like Ottawa, Freeport, and Alton. These encounters, now regarded as among the most significant in American political history, delved deeply into issues of slavery's morality, its constitutional status, and the implications of popular sovereignty, with Lincoln challenging Douglas's positions as enabling slavery's perpetuation, while Douglas accused Lincoln of radical abolitionism that could lead to racial equality. Although Lincoln edged out Douglas in the popular vote by about 4,000 ballots, he lost the Senate seat due to the state's legislative selection process, where Democrats held a majority in the General Assembly. Nonetheless, the debates elevated Lincoln's national profile, demonstrating his masterful rhetoric, logical precision, and ability to articulate complex ideas accessibly, transforming him from a regional figure into a potential presidential contender. Analysis shows the debate's legacy in clarifying national issues, with Lincoln's Freeport Doctrine question forcing Douglas to alienate Southern Democrats, aiding Lincoln's 1860 win. On February 27, 1860, Lincoln delivered a landmark address at Cooper Union in New York City, invited by Republican leaders to speak to an influential Eastern audience of 1,500 and bolster his credentials beyond the Midwest. In this meticulously researched speech lasting over 90 minutes, he methodically argued that a majority of the Founding Fathers intended to restrict slavery's growth, citing historical evidence from their votes and writings, like 21 of 39 signers of the Constitution supporting containment, to refute claims that the Constitution protected its indefinite expansion. By emphasizing the moral wrongness of slavery and the need for the Republican Party to uphold the founders' vision of containing it until it could be eradicated peacefully, Lincoln positioned himself as a principled moderate who sought to prevent disunion while advancing ethical governance. The address was a resounding success, reprinted widely in newspapers like the New York Tribune, and earning acclaim for its clarity and erudition, which significantly enhanced his reputation among Eastern Republicans and paved the way for his emergence as a frontrunner for the party's presidential nomination later that year. A rare quote from the speech, "Let us have faith that right makes might, and in that faith let us to the end dare to do our duty as we understand it," encapsulating his blend of morality and resolve. At the Republican National Convention held in Chicago from May 16th to 18th, 1860, Lincoln, often described as a relatively obscure prairie lawyer with no executive experience and limited national recognition outside the debates, unexpectedly clinched the presidential nomination on the third ballot after intense maneuvering by his supporters, including promises of cabinet posts. His appeal lay in his moderate views on slavery, opposing its extension but not immediate abolition in existing states to avoid war, combined with strong endorsement of traditional Whig economic policies, including internal improvements like railroads and canals, as well as protective tariffs to bolster American industry against foreign competition. Hannibal Hamlin, a former Democrat from Maine, known for his anti-slavery stance, was selected as his vice presidential running mate to balance the ticket geographically, north-south, and ideologically, radical moderate. Uniquely among the candidates, Lincoln refrained from delivering any campaign speeches, adhering to the era's customs for presidential aspirants to maintain dignity, and instead relied on the vigorous organizational efforts of Republican activists who distributed pamphlets, organized rallies with wide-awake torchlight parades, and promoted his image as a self-made man who had risen from log cabin poverty through hard work and integrity, resonating with voters seeking honest leadership amid growing sectional tensions. Deep analysis from the Library of Congress exhibits reveals how Lincoln's team used his rail splitter persona to appeal to working-class voters, a savvy marketing that masked his legal sophistication. On November 6, 1860, Abraham Lincoln achieved a historic victory in the presidential election, becoming the 16th President of the United States as the Republican candidate, with his success driven entirely by strong support from the northern and western states, where he captured 180 electoral votes to 123 for his opponents combined. Notably, he received no electoral votes from 10 of the 15 southern slave states, and in many southern areas, his name was not even on the ballot due to fears of his anti-slavery views, reflecting the deep sectional divide over slavery and states' rights that had been festering since the nation's founding. This electoral triumph was interpreted by pro-slavery advocates in the South as a direct threat to their economic and social system, viewing it as a rejection of their constitutional right to maintain slavery, which prompted immediate calls for secession to protect their interests and way of life. Consequently, even before Lincoln's inauguration, Southern states began to act on these fears. South Carolina seceded first on December 20th, 1860, followed by 6 others: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. By February 1861, forming the Confederate States of America under a provisional government led by Jefferson Davis, a former U.S. Senator. Lincoln, steadfast in his commitment to preserving the Union as the paramount duty, refused to acknowledge the legitimacy of these secessions, declaring them unconstitutional and illegal acts of rebellion that could not dissolve the perpetual bonds of the Federal Republic established by the Constitution. As Lincoln prepared for his inauguration on March 4, 1861, the nation teetered on the brink of dissolution, with the 7 seceded states having already established their confederacy and seized federal properties within their borders, including arsenals and forts. In his first inaugural address, delivered amid heightened tensions and under heavy security due to assassination threats, including rumored plots by Baltimore secessionists, Lincoln sought to reassure the South by affirming that he had no intention or legal authority to interfere with slavery in the states where it already existed, emphasizing his oath to uphold the Constitution and the rule of law. He appealed fervently for national unity, invoking shared history and bonds by stating, "We are not enemies but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic chords of memory will yet swell the chorus of the Union, urging peaceful resolution to avert conflict, while warning that any aggression against the Union would be met with resolve to hold federal property." However, mere weeks into his presidency, on April 12, 1861, Confederate forces bombarded Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. Following Lincoln's decision to resupply the federal garrison there without reinforcing it militarily, an action he saw as essential to maintaining federal authority without provocation. This assault, which forced the fort's surrender after 34 hours of shelling with no Union fatalities during the bombardment itself, but one accidental death afterward, marked the outbreak of the Civil War, the bloodiest conflict in American history, as Lincoln interpreted it as a direct assault on the nation's sovereignty and unity, compelling him to respond decisively to suppress the insurrection. In the wake of Fort Sumter's fall, Lincoln swiftly mobilized the Union's resources, issuing a call on April 15, 1861, for 75,000 volunteer troops to serve for 3 months to suppress the rebellion and restore federal control, framing the effort as a defense of the Constitution rather than an invasion or war on slavery. This proclamation prompted 4 more southern states, Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee, to secede and join the Confederacy, escalating the crisis into a full-scale sectional war that would last 4 years and redefine the nation. As Commander-in-Chief, Lincoln exercised extraordinary wartime powers from the outset, expanding executive authority in ways unprecedented for a president, including imposing a naval blockade on southern ports to cripple Confederate trade and cotton exports, authorizing the suspension of habeas corpus to detain thousands of suspected Confederate sympathizers without trial in border states like Maryland, and shutting down newspapers deemed hostile or seditious to the Union cause, such as the New York Journal of Commerce. He justified these measures as temporary necessities during an existential national emergency, comparing his role to that of a physician administering harsh but life-saving medicine to a gravely ill patient, arguing that the preservation of the Union superseded strict adherence to peacetime civil liberties in the face of rebellion. Critics, including Chief Justice Roger Taney in Ex parte Merryman, challenged these actions as unconstitutional, but Lincoln persisted, believing the Constitution allowed flexibility in crisis, a view that set precedents for future presidents. The early phases of the Civil War in 1861 and 1862 were marked by significant Union setbacks, including the disastrous defeat at the First Battle of Bull Run, Manassas, in July 1861, where poorly trained federal troops fled in disarray after initial gains, shattering illusions of a quick victory and highlighting the war's potential for prolonged bloodshed with over 4,700 casualties. Lincoln faced mounting criticism from abolitionists like Frederick Douglass for not moving faster toward emancipation, from radicals in his party for perceived leniency toward the South, and from the public for the sluggish military progress, all while grappling with the immense pressure of leading a divided nation amid personal grief over Willie's death. Central to these challenges was his fraught relationship with Union generals, particularly George B. McClellan, whom he appointed as General-in-Chief of the armies in November 1861 after Winfield Scott's retirement due to age. McClellan, a skilled organizer who rebuilt the Army of the Potomac into a disciplined force of 100,000 men, frustrated Lincoln with his excessive caution and delays in launching offensives, often overestimating enemy strength, claiming Lee had 200,000 troops when it was half that, and demanding more resources, leading to stalled campaigns like the Peninsula Campaign in 1862, where he failed to capture Richmond. Exasperated, Lincoln removed McClellan from overall command in March 1862 and later from field command after the Battle of Antietam in September, seeking more aggressive leadership. To compensate for his own lack of military expertise, Lincoln had only militia experience. He immersed himself in strategic studies, borrowing and reading works such as Henry Halleck's Elements of Military Art and Science from the Library of Congress, which informed his decisions and helped him evolve into a more effective wartime commander who micromanaged telegraphs and visits to the front. From the war's inception, Lincoln's primary objective was the restoration of the Union, carefully avoiding actions that might alienate the border slave states, Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, and Delaware, that remained loyal but retained slavery, fearing that premature emancipation could push them toward secession and tip the balance. However, as the conflict dragged on and Union casualties mounted to hundreds of thousands, he gradually recognized that abolishing slavery was essential not only morally, but strategically for victory. as it would deprive the Confederacy of its labor force of 3.5 million enslaved people, undermine its economy based on Cotton King. This shift became evident when he signed the first Confiscation Act in August 1861, which authorized the seizure and liberation of slaves owned by those aiding the rebellion, marking an initial step toward using war powers against slavery as contraband of war. Lincoln understood the Constitution's limitations on federal interference with slavery in existing states during peacetime, but as commander-in-chief, he asserted authority under military necessity to target it as a wartime measure, viewing emancipation as a tool to weaken the enemy while aligning the war with higher principles of justice and human rights. Building on this evolving stance, Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation on September 22, 1862, following the Union's tactical victory at Antietam, which halted Lee's invasion of Maryland and provided a political window for such a bold move by demonstrating military progress with 23,000 casualties in a single day. The final proclamation took effect on January 1st, 1863, declaring that all enslaved persons in areas still in rebellion against the United States shall be thenceforward, and forever free, applying specifically to Confederate-held territories and exempting Union-controlled areas and border states to maintain loyalty there. Lincoln regarded this executive order as the most righteous and consequential act of his presidency, transforming the war into a moral crusade against slavery and enabling the enlistment of African Americans into the Union Army and Navy, with nearly 200,000 black soldiers and sailors joining by war's end, bolstering Union manpower significantly and proving their valor in battles like Fort Wagner. Internationally, the proclamation deterred European powers like Britain and France from recognizing or aiding the Confederacy, as it framed the conflict as a fight for human freedom rather than mere political reunion, shifting public opinion abroad where anti-slavery sentiment was strong. Deep insights from Britannica emphasize how this document, while limited in immediate effect, it didn't free slaves in loyal areas, was a masterstroke of timing and legality, using war powers to achieve what Congress couldn't. In the aftermath of the pivotal Union victory at the Battle of Gettysburg in early July 1863, which repelled a major Confederate invasion of the North and inflicted heavy losses on Robert E. Lee's army, over 50,000 casualties in 3 days, Lincoln traveled to the battlefield site in November 1863 to dedicate a national cemetery for the fallen soldiers. There, on November 19th, he delivered the Gettysburg Address, a concise yet profound speech lasting just over 2 minutes and 272 words, which redefined the war's purpose and the nation's identity in democratic terms. In it, he invoked the Declaration of Independence's ideals, asserting that the United States was conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, and portrayed the conflict as a test of whether a government of the people, by the people, for the people could endure amid civil strife. He honored the dead by calling for a new birth of freedom to ensure their sacrifices were not in vain, emphasizing themes of equality, democracy, and national renewal that have since become cornerstones of American rhetoric and identity, influencing leaders from Martin Luther King Jr. to modern presidents. The address's brevity belied its depth. Lincoln crafted it meticulously, revising drafts to distill complex ideas into poetic prose. As the war entered its later stages, Lincoln identified Ulysses S. Grant as the aggressive commander he needed, impressed by Grant's tenacity in campaigns like the Battle of Shiloh in April 1862, where Grant turned near defeat into victory despite 23,000 casualties, and the Siege of Vicksburg in July 1863, which split the Confederacy and secured Union control of the Mississippi River, a strategic masterstroke. In March 1864, Lincoln promoted Grant to lieutenant general, a rank last held by George Washington, and appointed him general-in-chief of all Union armies, granting him broad authority to pursue a strategy of total war that targeted not just armies, but Southern infrastructure and morale. Grant's overland campaign in Virginia that spring and summer, though resulting in staggering Union casualties, exceeding 50,000 in battles like the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Cold Harbor, relentlessly pressured Lee's forces through attrition, gradually eroding Confederate resources and will. Lincoln supported Grant's tactics, including the destruction of Southern railroads, farms, and supply lines exemplified by Sherman's march to the sea to demoralize the enemy and cripple their war effort. This unyielding approach culminated in the surrender of Lee's Army of Northern Virginia to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865, effectively signaling the end of major combat operations and the collapse of the Confederacy, though sporadic fighting continued briefly elsewhere until June. Analysis from the Miller Center highlights Lincoln's growth as a strategist, from early frustrations with cautious generals to embracing Grant's relentlessness, reflecting his adaptability under pressure. Amid the war's uncertainties in 1864, Lincoln demonstrated his political acumen by navigating internal Republican divisions between radicals pushing for harsher Reconstruction policies like land redistribution and moderates favoring leniency, while also courting pro-Union Democrats to broaden his coalition. He ran for re-election under the banner of the National Union Party, a temporary alliance designed to appeal beyond strict Republicans and include war Democrats, selecting Andrew Johnson, a Unionist from Tennessee who owned slaves but stayed loyal, as his vice presidential running mate to symbolize national reconciliation and Southern inclusion. Early in the campaign, Lincoln faced pessimism due to high casualties, over 100,000 in Grant's campaign alone, draft riots in New York that killed over 120 and stalled military progress, even drafting a blind memorandum in August, anticipating defeat and pledging to cooperate with the victor until inauguration. However, key Union triumphs, such as William T. Sherman's capture of Atlanta in September 1864, a vital rail hub, and David Farragut's naval victory at Mobile Bay in August with his famous "Damn the Torpedoes," reversed the tide, boosting Northern morale and voter confidence. On November 8, 1864, Lincoln secured a resounding victory, winning 212 electoral votes to George McClellan's 21, carrying all but 3 states, Kentucky, Delaware, and New Jersey, and garnering 55% of the popular vote amid high turnout, a mandate that affirmed public support for his leadership, the war's continuation to total victory and emancipation. With the war nearing its conclusion, Lincoln delivered his second inaugural address on March 4, 1865, a reflective and conciliatory speech of 701 words that attributed the conflict's horrors, over 620,000 deaths and widespread destruction, to divine providence as punishment for the sin of American slavery shared by North and South alike in their complicity. He urged a spirit of healing and forgiveness, famously calling for malice toward none, with charity for all, and advocated binding up the nation's wounds to achieve a just and lasting peace, emphasizing reconstruction through compassion rather than vengeance, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see it. This address rich in biblical references, quoting Psalms and Matthew, reveals Lincoln's deepening religiosity amid war's toll, a personal evolution from skeptic to providential believer. In the war's final months and immediate aftermath, Lincoln prioritized a lenient Reconstruction policy aimed at swiftly reintegrating the South states into the Union while ensuring the permanent abolition of slavery, viewing rapid reconciliation as essential to healing sectional scars and preventing prolonged bitterness. As early as December 1863, he issued the Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction, offering full pardons to most Confederates who took an oath of loyalty to the Union and accepted emancipation, requiring only 10% of a state's 1860 voters to form a loyal government for readmission, a plan criticized by radicals like Thaddeus Stevens as too forgiving and lacking protections for freedmen. He vigorously championed the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which would outlaw slavery nationwide and settle the whole question beyond wartime measures, lobbying Congress personally, using patronage and persuasion, to secure its passage in the House on January 31st, 1865, after Senate approval the previous year. It was ratified by the states in December 1865 amid celebrations. Additionally, in March 1865, Lincoln signed legislation establishing the Freedmen's Bureau, an agency tasked with providing food, education, medical care, legal aid, and land redistribution to newly freed slaves and war refugees, reflecting his commitment to supporting African Americans' transition to freedom and citizenship amid the challenges of post-war society, including poverty and discrimination. Though the Bureau faced opposition and limited funding, it educated over 150,000 freed people, a step toward equality. On April 14, 1865, mere days after the effective end of the Civil War, with Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox, President Abraham Lincoln attended a performance of the comedy Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., seeking a moment of respite amid the nation's healing process and his own exhaustion. There, John Wilkes Booth, a renowned actor and ardent Confederate sympathizer who harbored deep resentment toward Lincoln, viewing him as a tyrant responsible for the South's defeat and the emancipation of slaves, carried out a meticulously planned attack. Booth had originally conspired with others, including Lewis Powell and George Atzerodt, to kidnap Lincoln in March 1865 as leverage to revive Confederate fortunes and exchange for prisoners. But after hearing Lincoln's speech on April 11th advocating limited voting rights for African Americans, specifically for those who were educated or had served in the Union Army, Booth shifted to assassination, believing it would avenge the South, disrupt Union victory, and inspire renewed resistance. Sneaking into the presidential box during a moment of laughter from the audience to mask the sound, Booth shot Lincoln in the back of the head with a .44 caliber Derringer pistol at close range, then leaped to the stage shouting, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always to tyrants, the Virginia state motto, before escaping despite breaking his leg in the 12-foot fall and fleeing on horseback. Lincoln, gravely wounded with the bullet lodging behind his right eye, was carried across the street to Peterson House, a modest boarding house at 453 10th Street, where doctors attended to him through the night, but the injury caused irreversible brain damage and swelling. He lingered unconscious for 9 hours, surrounded by cabinet members, family including Robert, and physicians like Charles Leal, who probed the wound, before passing away at 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865, at the age of 56, becoming the first U.S. president to be assassinated. Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton, present at the bedside, solemnly declared, "Now he belongs to the ages," capturing the profound sense of loss as news spread rapidly via telegraph across a nation still reeling from war. The nation plunged into mourning, with flags lowered to half-staff, businesses closing, and public gatherings for prayer. Lincoln's body was embalmed and lay in state at the White House before embarking on a 1,700-mile funeral train journey through 7 northern states, stopping in major cities like Philadelphia, New York, where 500,000 viewed him, and Chicago for massive public viewings that drew millions, symbolizing collective grief and unity in the war-torn country. A rare fact was Lincoln had dreamed of his own assassination days before. Seeing a corpse in the White House and hearing it was the president, as recorded in Ward Hill Laymon's recollections. Booth, driven by a distorted sense of patriotism and influenced by his brother's Union sympathies that contrasted his own, believed his act would rally the South, serve his nation and race by eliminating a perceived tyrant and potentially reignite Confederate resistance. But instead, it unified the North in outrage and determination while horrifying even many Southerners. Historians widely speculate that Lincoln's assassination profoundly altered the course of Reconstruction. The post-war effort to rebuild the South and integrate 4 million freed slaves, with his moderate approach favoring leniency toward former Confederates, such as his 10% loyalty oath plan, and gradual civil rights advancements like black suffrage for veterans. Many argue that his survival might have prevented the harsh radical Republican policies that clashed with President Andrew Johnson's leniency, potentially averting the backlash that led to Jim Crow laws, sharecropping exploitation, and delayed full equality until the civil rights movement of the 1960s. This shift, some contend, contributed to the need for later figures such as Martin Luther King Jr., as entrenched racial injustices persisted without Lincoln's balancing influence to bridge sectional divides and promote reconciliation with strong protections for African Americans. Ultimately, the assassination elevated Lincoln's martyrdom, solidifying his image as a national hero who sacrificed his life for the Union and emancipation, transforming public perception from a divisive wartime leader criticized as a baboon by opponents to an enduring symbol of American ideals. Throughout his life, Lincoln's perspectives on race and equality were multifaceted and subject to ongoing scholarly debate, evolving significantly from his early political career through the Civil War, reflecting both the era's prejudices and his growing moral convictions amid personal interactions and war's realities. In the 1858 Lincoln-Douglas debates, he explicitly stated opposition to full social and political equality between whites and blacks, asserting that physical differences would forever prevent them from living together on terms of equality and acknowledging a superiority assigned to the white race, positions that aligned with widespread white supremacist views of the time and helped him appeal to Illinois voters wary of abolitionism. However, even then, Lincoln consistently condemned slavery as morally and politically wrong, insisting it must end eventually, and affirmed that African Americans deserved the inalienable rights outlined in the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, equally with white men, distinguishing between natural rights and social privileges like intermarriage or jury service. As the war progressed, his views shifted markedly, influenced by interactions with black leaders like Frederick Douglass, who challenged him in White House meetings, and the valor of black Union soldiers in units like the 54th Massachusetts. Lincoln supported suffrage for the educated African Americans and military veterans. By 1864 to 1865, hosted black delegations at the White House, a presidential first, and pushed for the 13th Amendment, demonstrating a trajectory toward greater racial justice amid the conflict's demands and his own ethical growth. A striking lesser-heard quote from an 1858 debate, "I hope to have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky," often misattributed, but reflecting his pragmatic balancing of ideals and strategy. Lincoln's religious beliefs, though never formalized through church membership, he attended but never joined Presbyterian services with Mary, were deeply personal and intertwined with his life experiences, providing solace during trials and shaping his public rhetoric with a sense of providence. Raised in a Baptist family with exposure to frontier preachers who emphasized predestination, he rejected organized religion's dogmas early on, influenced by rationalist thinkers like Thomas Paine and Voltaire, but maintained a profound reverence for the Bible, which he studied avidly and quoted extensively in speeches, letters, and proclamations, over 100 times as president alone, drawing from passages like the Sermon on the Mount for mercy or Psalms for comfort. He often employed religious language to express faith in divine providence, especially in his second inaugural address, where he invoked God 14 times and referenced Scripture to interpret the war as punishment for slavery, suggesting both sides bore guilt. Yet he turned to God most intensely during personal melancholy, exacerbated by the deaths of sons, Eddie in 1850 and Willie in 1862, finding comfort in prayer and a fatalistic trust in a higher power without adhering to traditional Christian doctrines like the divinity of Jesus or eternal damnation. Historians like Alan Guelzo and Abraham Lincoln, Redeemer President, analyze this as a providential deism, where Lincoln saw history as guided by an inscrutable God, helping him cope with the war's horrors and his own depressions. In the years following his death, Lincoln's legacy has been enshrined as one of the most revered in American history, consistently ranked among the top 3 presidents, often first in scholarly polls, alongside George Washington and Franklin D. Roosevelt. Celebrated for preserving the Union against secession, vindicating democratic principles through crisis leadership, and abolishing slavery via the Emancipation Proclamation and 13th Amendment, actions that redefined freedom for millions. His image permeates national iconography, appearing on the penny since 1909, the first U.S. coin to feature a real person, and the $5 bill, while countless towns, cities, counties, schools, and memorials bear his name, including the majestic Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., dedicated in 1922 as a symbol of unity, where King delivered "I Have a Dream," and his carved likeness on Mount Rushmore since 1941 alongside other founders. Historical sites like his Kentucky birthplace, now a national park with a symbolic cabin, Indiana boyhood home amid the woods where he grew, and Springfield, Illinois, residence preserved as a National Historic Site, draw visitors to reflect on his humble origins and rise. Contemporaries such as poet Walt Whitman, who eulogized him in "O Captain, My Captain," for his compassion and integrity amid the war's malice, and Frederick Douglass, who praised his fairness despite initial disagreements on race, calling him the king of self-made men, contributed to this enduring admiration, portraying Lincoln as a self-made leader whose empathy and resolve defined America's moral arc toward justice. And so our journey through the life of Abraham Lincoln comes to an end. From a humble log cabin in the Kentucky wilderness, a man rose not only to shape the destiny of a nation, but to leave a legacy that echoes eternally in the conscience of humanity. Lincoln was not a saint. He was a man of his time with his own contradictions, an evolving view on race, a melancholy that bordered on despair, a pragmatism that sometimes delayed justice, and an evolution in his thinking on the most agonizing of issues. But it was this growth in his understanding, his steadfast commitment to what was right even when faced with impossible choices, that forged him into a great icon. The man who carried the burden of personal loss and a bloody civil war was the same man who spoke of malice toward none, with charity for all, embodying the fragile beauty of human resilience. The shot fired at Ford's Theater that night seemed to extinguish the dawn of hope, but history has proven otherwise. That shot etched Lincoln's image into eternity. It transformed a president into a martyr, and his life into a legend of sacrifice for the highest ideal, a unified nation where freedom was no longer the privilege of a few, but the birthright of all. His legacy lies not just in marble statues or on coins, but in the very fabric of American democracy. Whenever America faces division, people return to the words of Lincoln. Whenever the struggle for equality and justice rises, his spirit is reborn. Ultimately, the story of Abraham Lincoln is a powerful reminder that from the humblest of beginnings, an unyielding will and a firm moral compass can change the world. He proved that a house, no matter how divided, could still be healed through empathy, courage, and an unwavering belief in the better angels of our nature. As we reflect on his life, let's remember a rarely heard quote that captures his humility. I claim not to have controlled events, but confess plainly that events have controlled me, from an 1864 letter, revealing a man who navigated history's currents with grace amid profound personal pain.